3 pages of paper, 370 words, found on a staircase in Boulder, Colorado, on December 26, 1996. For nearly 3 decades, this ransom note has been called the most analyzed document in criminal history. But here's what nobody talks about. If you actually read this note, if you really examine what it says and how it says it, one thing becomes disturbingly clear. This was never written to collect ransom money. The note demands exactly $118,000 for the safe return of 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey. It threatens death if the family contacts police. It promises a phone call with pickup instructions. It warns against surveillance. It reads like a kidnapper's playbook, except for one problem. When this note was discovered at 5:45 a.m., JonBenét was already dead in the basement of her own home. She had been dead for hours. So if this wasn't written to collect money, what was it really written for? Tonight on Unresolved, a case study, we're going to examine this document word by word, contradiction by contradiction, until we understand what we're actually looking at. Because this note isn't evidence of a kidnapping, it's evidence of something else entirely, something much more disturbing. The question isn't who wrote it, the question is why they needed it to exist. Let's start with what makes this ransom note so unusual that it defies every pattern law enforcement has seen before or since. Most ransom notes are short, brutally short. We have your daughter, $500,000 cash. Wait for contact. No police. 5 sentences, maybe 10. Direct, functional, terrifying. The JonBenét note is different. It's 370 words across 2.5 pages. It rambles, it threatens, it lectures. It sounds like someone performing the role of a kidnapper rather than actually being one. But the length itself creates a psychological puzzle that investigators have wrestled with for decades. Writing 370 words takes time, real time. Even if you're writing quickly, frantically, you're looking at 15 to 20 minutes minimum. If you're being careful, composing, thinking about word choice, you're looking at 30 minutes or more. What kidnapper has 30 minutes to spare while sitting in someone else's house with a dead child in the basement? The note was written on a legal pad, found inside the Ramsey home. Not brought by an intruder, found inside. The pen used was also from the house, a black felt-tip marker that was carefully returned to its holder in the kitchen after the note was written. Think about that behavior for a moment. What kidnapper breaks into a house, writes a ransom note, using the family's own supplies, then puts the pen back where it belongs? This detail has haunted investigators because it suggests a level of psychological organization that seems incompatible with the chaos of murder. Someone who has just killed a child doesn't typically engage in housekeeping. They flee, they panic, they make mistakes. But this person took the time to return office supplies to their proper location. The behavior suggests either someone so familiar with the house that cleanup became automatic, or someone so psychologically controlled that they maintain normal routines even while committing horrible crimes. But it gets stranger. Inside that same notepad, investigators found something that changed everything. Practice drafts. Someone had started writing Mr. and Mrs. R then stopped, tore out the page, and began again with Mr. Ramsey. Someone sat in that house, comfortable and unhurried, writing multiple versions of this note, taking their time, getting it right. The practice drafts reveal something deeply unsettling about the author's mindset. This wasn't desperate scribbling in panic. This was careful composition. Someone made a conscious decision that Mr. and Mrs. R didn't achieve the right effect. They wanted something more formal, more distant. Mr. Ramsey created psychological space between the writer and the family. It suggested professional detachment rather than personal vendetta. What do you think this revision process reveals about the author's state of mind? Does it suggest someone who is thinking clearly and strategically, or someone whose psychology was fracturing under extreme stress? The handwriting analysis became a maze of contradictions. 4 experts examined the note. John Ramsey was ruled out immediately. His handwriting bore no resemblance. But Patsy Ramsey couldn't be ruled out. 2 experts found similarities troubling enough that they couldn't eliminate her as the author. 2 others called the evidence inconclusive. Yet no expert would definitively say she wrote it. The handwriting seemed deliberately disguised, as if someone was trying to alter their natural style while still betraying certain unconscious patterns. The psychological implications of disguised handwriting add another layer of complexity to an already complex document. Deliberately altering your natural handwriting requires conscious effort and sustained attention. It's not something you do automatically under stress. It's something you plan. It suggests premeditation, calculation, awareness that this document would be analyzed forensically. But maintaining disguised handwriting across 370 words is extraordinarily difficult. Natural patterns creep back in. Muscle memory reasserts itself. Stress makes conscious control harder to maintain. The fact that this note shows evidence of both disguise and natural characteristics suggests someone who is trying to hide their identity, but couldn't sustain perfect control throughout the entire document. Which brings us to the content itself, because this is where the note stops making sense as the work of actual kidnappers. The ransom demand is $118,000. Not a round number. Not the millions you'd expect someone to demand from a wealthy businessman, but a very specific figure that happened to be almost exactly the amount of John Ramsey's recent Christmas bonus from Axis Graphics. How would random kidnappers know that number? It wasn't public information. It was intimate family knowledge. The specificity of this amount creates what investigators call an inside knowledge problem. Random kidnappers might guess that a successful businessman could afford $100,000 or $500,000 or even $1 million, but they wouldn't guess $118,000. That number comes from knowing exactly how much money John Ramsey had recently received, exactly what he could access without creating suspicion, exactly what amount would seem both achievable and significant. This level of financial intimacy suggests either someone with direct access to family financial information or someone who had conducted sophisticated surveillance over an extended period. Neither possibility offers comfort to those seeking simple explanations. The note specifies denominations: $100,000 in $100 bills, $18,000 in 20s. Real kidnappers typically don't care about bill denominations. They want the money, period. But this note reads like someone who's seen too many crime movies, someone trying to sound professional without understanding how these crimes actually work. The denomination specificity creates another psychological puzzle. Why would someone committing their first kidnapping have such detailed opinions about currency handling? The instruction suggests either extensive research into kidnapping methodology or personal experience with large cash transactions. Both possibilities narrow the field of potential authors significantly. Then there are the movie references. Linguistic experts identified phrases lifted almost directly from popular films. "Don't try to grow a brain" echoes a line from the movie Speed. The overall tone mirrors Dirty Harry and other crime thrillers. The note doesn't sound like authentic criminal communication. It sounds like someone's idea of what criminal communication should sound like. But the movie references create a deeper problem than simple Hollywood influence. They suggest someone who is thinking about performance while writing about murder. Someone who is conscious of dramatic effect while dealing with horrific reality. This psychological split between entertainment consumption and criminal behavior reveals something disturbing about the author's mental state. If this interpretation is correct, how do you explain someone who could reference action movies while looking at a dead child? What kind of psychological compartmentalization allows that level of detachment? The note doesn't sound like authentic criminal communication. It sounds like someone's idea of what criminal communication should sound like. But perhaps the most revealing aspect is the tone itself. Real kidnappers are brief because they're terrified. They want to make their demand and disappear. This note takes time to establish character. It explains motivations. It refers to the writer as, "We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction." What does that even mean? Which faction? Representing what cause? The note never explains because it doesn't need to be real. It just needs to sound real. The elaborate fictional background creates what psychologists call unnecessary complexity. Real criminals keep their stories simple because simple stories are easier to remember and harder to contradict. Complex stories require complex lies, and complex lies collapse under investigation. But this note builds an elaborate narrative about foreign factions and business motivations that serves no practical purpose in a real kidnapping. The psychological investment in fictional detail suggests someone who is either genuinely delusional about their motivations or consciously creating disinformation to misdirect investigation. Neither explanation suggests normal criminal psychology. The inconsistency in pronouns tells another story. The note switches between we and I without apparent awareness. "We are a group" becomes "I will call you." This suggests a single person writing while trying to create the impression of multiple kidnappers. But the pronoun inconsistency reveals something deeper than simple deception. Maintaining fictional perspective requires sustained psychological effort. You have to remember which character you're playing, which voice you're using, which persona you've created. The fact that the author slipped between we and I suggests either genuine confusion about their identity or inability to maintain fictional consistency under stress. What does this linguistic failure tell us about the author's psychological state? Were they fracturing under pressure, or were they simply inexperienced at sustained deception? Here's what really happened when this note was discovered, and why the timeline makes the kidnapping scenario impossible. At 5:52 a.m., Patsy Ramsey called 911 reporting a kidnapping. The ransom note specified that kidnappers would call between 8 and 10 a.m. with pickup instructions. The family waited. 8 o'clock passed, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, no call. Because you can't call to arrange a ransom exchange for someone who's already dead. The promised phone call creates one of the most damning timeline contradictions in the entire case. Whoever wrote this note committed to a specific action at a specific time. They promised to call between 8 and 10 a.m. on December 26th. This wasn't a vague threat or general instruction. This was a concrete commitment that required the kidnappers to be alive, free, and motivated to continue their crime at a specific moment in the future. But no call came, ever. Which means either the kidnappers abandoned their plan for unknown reasons, or the call was always impossible because the kidnappers never existed. At 1:05 p.m., John Ramsey found JonBenét's body in the basement wine cellar. She was cold, stiff. Rigor mortis had set in. The coroner estimated she had been dead for at least 6 hours, possibly longer. This means she died sometime before 8 a.m., possibly as early as midnight. The medical timeline creates what investigators call a terminal contradiction in the kidnapping narrative. If JonBenet died at midnight, the ransom note was written 8 hours after kidnapping became impossible. If she died at 2 a.m., the note was written 6 hours after the crime had moved from kidnapping to murder. If she died at 6 a.m., the note was written at least 2 hours after any realistic kidnapping window had closed. No matter how you adjust the medical estimates, the note was written when the author knew or should have known that JonBenet couldn't be returned alive. Yet, the note maintains the fiction of safe return, successful exchange, and mutual satisfaction. Someone wrote 370 words about a transaction they knew couldn't happen. So, when was this 3-page ransom note written? If JonBenet was killed between midnight and 2 a.m., and her body was found at 1 p.m., that note was written while she was already dead or dying in the basement. It wasn't written to facilitate a kidnapping. It was written to explain why a body was about to be discovered. The temporal impossibility of the kidnapping scenario forces a disturbing conclusion. This note was always meant to be found rather than acted upon. Someone invested significant time and effort in creating elaborate fiction that they knew would never be tested. They wrote detailed instructions for exchanges that would never occur, described consequences that would never be implemented, made promises that would never be kept. What do you think this detail really means? If the note wasn't written to collect money, what purpose did it serve? The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit reviewed this note and reached a disturbing conclusion. This was very likely what they call staging, a document created not to advance a crime, but to misdirect the investigation of a crime that had already occurred. But staging implies a level of criminal sophistication that most people find difficult to accept. Staging means someone was thinking about investigation while dealing with murder. Someone was anticipating police response while looking at a dead child. Someone was crafting false evidence while their hands were still metaphorically bloody from their crime. The psychological profile of someone capable of such calculated staging is deeply unsettling. This isn't passion killing followed by panic. This isn't accidental death followed by desperate cover-up. This is methodical evidence manipulation that requires extraordinary self-control under extreme circumstances. But who would need to misdirect the investigation, and why? Some analysts believe the note points to someone inside the Ramsey household. The reasoning seems logical at first glance. The materials came from inside the house. The ransom amount matched inside knowledge. The writing took time that only someone comfortable in the house would have. No signs of forced entry were found. The note was placed where Patsy would definitely discover it during her morning routine. The circumstantial case for inside involvement appears overwhelming when viewed through this analytical framework. Every major element of the note materials, knowledge, timing, placement, points towards someone with intimate access to the house and family. The probability that an outsider could achieve this level of access and knowledge seems vanishingly small. But immediately, other experts challenge each of these conclusions. The materials could have been found by an intruder who had time to explore. The bonus amount might have been discovered through documents left accessible. Time to write could have been available to someone hiding in the house while the family slept. The absence of obvious forced entry doesn't prove no one entered the basement window was found unlatched. Each piece of evidence that seems to prove inside involvement can be explained through outside involvement if you adjust your assumptions about criminal capability and preparation. An intruder who spent weeks planning this crime could have gained the knowledge and access necessary to write this note. The question becomes whether such elaborate preparation seems more or less likely than family involvement. The handwriting analysis that couldn't rule out Patsy is countered by independent experts who found fundamental differences in pressure patterns and natural writing tendencies. The inside knowledge of house layout could have come from the holiday home tour that had occurred weeks before Christmas, when hundreds of strangers walked through every room, including the basement. The home tour creates what investigators call an access problem for both sides of the investigation. If hundreds of strangers toured the house, then inside knowledge doesn't necessarily indicate family involvement. But if hundreds of strangers toured the house, why didn't any of them become obvious suspects? The investigation focused almost immediately on the family, rather than working through the extensive list of people who had recent access to the house. This investigative choice reveals something important about how early assumptions shape evidence collection. If investigators had started with the assumption that one of the home tour participants was responsible, they would have collected different evidence, asked different questions, pursued different leads. The note would have been analyzed as the work of an outsider rather than an insider. Which explanation feels harder to accept? That family members could stage such an elaborate deception while genuinely grieving? Or that an intruder could gain such intimate knowledge and have such audacious confidence? The intruder theory creates its own set of problems, but it can't be dismissed. Boulder was experiencing a series of break-ins during late 1996. Several homes in the Ramsey neighborhood had been burglarized. An intruder could have entered earlier in the evening, perhaps while the family was at the Christmas party, and hidden until everyone was asleep. The break-in pattern in the neighborhood during this period suggests someone with intimate knowledge of the area, someone who understood family routines, someone who knew when houses would be empty. If this person had been conducting surveillance for weeks or months, they could have gained the kind of detailed knowledge reflected in the ransom note. But the surveillance theory requires assumptions about criminal dedication that seem almost implausible. Someone would have had to watch the Ramsey family extensively, learn their financial details, understand their holiday plans, and develop elaborate kidnapping strategies. The level of investment seems disproportionate to the potential reward, even for someone planning to demand $118,000. This person might have explored the house, found the notepad and pen, discovered financial documents that revealed the bonus amount. The plan could have been kidnapping for ransom, but something went wrong. JonBenét woke up. She screamed. She was struck to silence her. The intruder, realizing the kidnapping had become a murder, decided to leave the ransom note anyway, not to collect money, but to delay discovery and create confusion. But this theory struggles with timing. Writing a 370-word note with practice drafts takes significant time. Why would a panicked intruder who had just committed murder spend 20 or 30 minutes writing an elaborate ransom note? Why not just flee immediately? The temporal contradiction between panic and composition creates what psychologists call a behavioral impossibility. People in genuine panic don't engage in careful writing. They don't revise their work. They don't maintain consistent fictional personas across multiple paragraphs. Panic produces short, fragmented communication, not elaborate narrative fiction. Yet, the note shows clear evidence of careful composition, conscious revision, and sustained attention to detail. Someone was thinking clearly enough to create complex sentences, maintain fictional perspective, and anticipate investigative response. This level of cognitive function seems incompatible with the psychological chaos of accidental murder. Unless the note wasn't written after the murder, unless it was written before. Some investigators theorize that the intruder had been planning this crime for weeks. He could have written the note in advance, brought it with him, then adapted it using materials in the house to make it appear spontaneous. This would explain the movie references and theatrical tone. It was composed carefully over time, not in panic. The premeditation theory solves several timing problems while creating new logical difficulties. If the note was written in advance, the author had time to craft elaborate fiction without time pressure. They could research movie quotes, develop fictional personas, and create detailed criminal narratives. The quality of the note makes more sense as careful advance work than desperate improvisation. But premeditation intensifies the inside knowledge problem. If someone wrote this note days or weeks before the crime, how did they know John's exact bonus amount? How did they know the family's holiday plans? How did they know which materials would be available in the house on Christmas night? Yet this raises new questions. If the note was pre-written, how did it include the exact bonus amount? How did it reference John Ramsey's business specifically? Either the intruder had incredibly detailed advanced knowledge, or the note was written on-site with access to family information. The advanced knowledge required for pre-written note becomes almost supernatural in its scope and accuracy. Someone would have needed financial information that wasn't public, personal details that weren't obvious, and logistical knowledge that required intimate access. The level of surveillance necessary to gain such knowledge would have been so extensive that it should have left obvious traces. If this interpretation is correct, how do you explain someone who could plan elaborate kidnapping fiction weeks in advance but couldn't foresee that their crime would become murder rather than kidnapping? The psychological analysis of the note reveals even deeper contradictions. Some sections read like genuine panic. Don't try to grow a brain, John. Other sections are oddly considerate. Make sure that you bring an adequate size attaché. The tone shifts between threatening and almost conversational, between amateur and sophisticated. The tonal inconsistency suggests someone whose psychological state was fluctuating dramatically while writing, panic alternating with control, rage alternating with politeness, aggression alternating with consideration. These emotional oscillations create a psychological portrait of someone under extreme stress, but fighting to maintain composure. Real ransom notes don't typically include phrases like, "We respect your business, but not the country that it serves." That's ideology, not criminal demand. It suggests someone creating a narrative, building a character, telling a story, rather than making a simple transaction. The ideological language creates what linguists call motivated fiction, elaborate background story that serves no practical purpose. Real kidnappers don't usually care about explaining their political motivations to victims' families. They care about money, escape, and avoiding capture. But this note invests significant effort in character development and motivational backstory. What psychological need does this fictional elaboration serve? Does it suggest someone who genuinely believed their own story, or someone who was overcompensating for the lack of authentic motivation? The references to John's Southern common sense indicate knowledge of his background. He was from Michigan and Georgia. The warning about stray dogs is unusual phrasing that linguistic experts couldn't trace to any common criminal or regional dialect. These elements suggest either very detailed advanced research or intimate personal knowledge. The biographical details create another layer of the inside knowledge problem. Knowing someone's regional background doesn't necessarily require a personal relationship, but it does require research or extended observation. Random criminals don't usually invest time in learning their victims' personal history unless they have specific reasons for targeting those particular victims. But perhaps the most psychologically revealing aspect is what the note doesn't say. It never actually describes what will happen if the ransom isn't paid. It threatens that JonBenét will be beheaded, but it doesn't explain how, when, or where. Real kidnappers often provide disturbing proof of their capability and willingness to harm victims. This note makes threats without substance, like someone who knows they'll never need to follow through. The absence of concrete threat details suggests someone who was uncomfortable with the violent implications of their own fiction. Someone who could write about murder in abstract terms, but couldn't imagine or describe the actual mechanics of violence. This psychological distance between fictional threat and real capability creates questions about whether the author was actually capable of the violence they were describing. Which brings us to a disturbing possibility. Maybe the author wasn't psychologically capable of real violence, but events spiraled beyond their control anyway. The investigation of this note became contaminated almost immediately, and understanding how that happened helps explain why certainty became impossible. Within an hour of the 911 call, the Ramsey house was filled with family, friends. Fleet and Priscilla White arrived, followed by John and Barbara Fernie, followed by Reverend Roll Hoverstock. All well-meaning people trying to comfort a grieving family, all unknowingly contaminating what should have been a pristine crime scene. The contamination problem extends far beyond simple DNA transfer. Every person who entered that house brought their own assumptions, observations, and interpretations. They processed the ransom note through their own frameworks of understanding. They developed opinions about what it meant and who could have written it. Their early impressions influenced their later testimony and created layers of interpretive bias that affected the entire investigation. Every person who entered that house was a potential source of DNA, fingerprints, and fiber evidence. When forensic experts later found unknown DNA on JonBenét's clothing, they couldn't definitively determine whether it came from her killer or from one of the many people who had been in the house that morning. The crime scene had been irreparably compromised before investigators realized they were dealing with a murder rather than a kidnapping. The evidentiary contamination created what forensic experts call analytical impossibility. When trace evidence could have come from dozens of different sources, it becomes scientifically meaningless. When fingerprints could have been deposited days or weeks before the crime, they lose investigative significance. When DNA could have been transferred through innocent contact, it can't definitively identify the perpetrator. The ransom note itself was handled by multiple people before being processed for evidence. Patsy had picked it up and read it. John had handled it. Police officers had examined it. By the time forensic experts analyzed it for trace evidence, any useful DNA or fingerprint evidence had been contaminated or destroyed. But the handling contamination goes deeper than simple evidence destruction. Every person who read the note formed immediate impressions about its meaning and authorship. These early impressions became fixed beliefs that influenced how they interpreted all subsequent evidence. The investigation became shaped by gut reactions formed in the first hours, rather than systematic analysis conducted over time. What does this pattern of contamination tell us about the reliability of the entire investigation? If the physical evidence was compromised and the interpretive framework was established before systematic analysis began, how can we trust any conclusions drawn from the available information? Media attention made objective analysis even more difficult. Within days, details about the note were leaked to reporters. Tabloids published excerpts. Television shows analyzed the handwriting. Public opinion formed before the investigation was complete. The case became a media sensation rather than a methodical criminal investigation. The media contamination created a feedback loop that persists today. Public attention generated pressure for quick solutions. Pressure for solutions encouraged premature conclusions. Premature conclusions became public narratives that influenced subsequent evidence interpretation. The investigation became driven by media dynamics rather than scientific methodology. The Boulder Police Department, a small-town force with limited experience in high-profile homicides, found themselves under intense scrutiny. Every decision was second-guessed. Every theory was debated publicly. The pressure to solve the case quickly led to tunnel vision, with investigators becoming invested in specific theories rather than following evidence wherever it led. The institutional pressure created what organizational psychologists call confirmation bias amplification. Investigators under extreme public pressure tend to find evidence that supports their initial theories rather than evidence that challenges those theories. They develop emotional investment in being right rather than objective commitment to finding truth. This created a feedback loop that persists today. Evidence that supports the family involvement theory is scrutinized differently than evidence that supports the intruder theory. Advocates for each position interpret the same facts in fundamentally different ways. The ransom note becomes either proof of staging or proof of an outside kidnapper, depending on which framework you accept. But the interpretive divergence reveals something troubling about the nature of evidence itself. The same document can support completely opposite conclusions, depending on which analytical framework you apply. The note contains enough genuine ambiguity that it can be read as either inside staging or outside kidnapping, depending on your initial assumptions. What makes this particularly tragic is that objective analysis became nearly impossible. The note exists. Its contents are factual, but its meaning has been obscured by decades of competing interpretations, each backed by credible experts, each addressing some evidence while struggling with other evidence. The tragedy isn't that we don't have enough evidence to understand this note. The tragedy is that we have too much analysis, too many theories, too many expert opinions that contradict each other. The note has been subjected to more scrutiny than any document in criminal history, but that scrutiny has produced confusion rather than clarity. If this theory is true, how do you explain the next part? The note promises specific actions that never occurred. It threatens consequences that never materialized. It describes a criminal enterprise that never functioned. Yet someone invested significant time and effort in creating this elaborate document. Why? The most unsettling possibility is that the note succeeded in its actual purpose, whatever that purpose was. If it was written to buy time, it bought 7 hours before JonBenét's body was discovered. If it was written to create confusion, it created confusion that persists 3 decades later. If it was written to misdirect investigation, the investigation focused immediately on family dynamics rather than searching for an unknown intruder. The success of the note at creating investigative chaos suggests either extraordinary luck or calculated planning. Random documents don't usually generate 30 years of expert disagreement. Random evidence doesn't usually create interpretive frameworks that are simultaneously logical and contradictory. Random criminal acts don't usually produce evidence that perfectly balances multiple competing theories. But this raises a final, disturbing question. Does someone know exactly why this note was written? Does someone understand its true purpose while the rest of us debate theories and analyze handwriting? Because this document didn't appear by accident. Every word was chosen. Every threat was calculated. Every reference was deliberate. The intentionality behind the note's construction becomes more evident the longer you study it. The movie references aren't accidental cultural echoes, they're specific choices that create specific effects. The length isn't rambling desperation, it's calculated misdirection that gives investigators more material to analyze and disagree about. The handwriting disguise isn't panicked concealment, it's strategic ambiguity that makes definitive attribution impossible. Someone sat down with a pen and paper and created this specific piece of evidence. They knew it would be found. They knew it would be analyzed. They knew it would shape the entire investigation. And it has shaped that investigation in exactly the way they intended. The competing interpretations of this note reveal something troubling about how we process evidence when emotions run high and stakes are enormous. Objective facts become malleable when filtered through different theoretical frameworks. The same document can support completely opposite conclusions depending on which assumptions you accept. Consider the length of the note. Those who believe it was written by someone in the house see the length as evidence of having unlimited time and comfort. Those who believe it was written by an intruder see the length as evidence of elaborate premeditation. Both interpretations use the same fact to support opposite conclusions. The interpretive flexibility reveals something fundamental about criminal evidence. It doesn't speak for itself. Evidence requires human interpretation, and human interpretation is influenced by psychological, cultural, and institutional factors that have nothing to do with the evidence itself. The practice drafts found in the notepad create the same interpretive split. Family theorists see this as evidence of someone with complete access to the house. Intruder theorists see this as evidence of someone who had hidden in the house long enough to become comfortable. Neither interpretation can be definitively proven wrong, but the practice drafts reveal something more disturbing than simple interpretive disagreement. Someone made conscious editorial decisions while writing about kidnapping and murder. Someone thought Mr. and Mrs. R wasn't quite right and revised it to Mr. Ramsey. Someone was engaged in artistic creation while dealing with horrific crime. What psychological state allows someone to engage in careful composition while surrounded by the evidence of violence? Does this suggest extraordinary self-control, complete dissociation, or something even more disturbing? The movie references present another fascinating divergence. Some experts see these references as evidence of someone educated and culturally aware, perhaps someone from the Ramseys' social circle. Others see them as evidence of someone obsessed with crime movies, possibly a fantasy-driven predator who had been planning this crime for months. But the movie references create a deeper psychological puzzle than simple cultural identification. Integrating entertainment fiction into criminal reality suggests someone whose mental boundaries between fantasy and reality had become dangerously blurred. This isn't normal criminal psychology. This is something more complex and disturbing. Even the return of the pen to its proper location is interpreted differently. Some see this as evidence of someone who knew exactly where everything belonged in the house. Others see this as evidence of someone so psychologically organized that they compulsively cleaned up even while committing murder. The pen replacement behavior creates what behavioral analysts call a psychological impossibility. Normal criminals don't engage in housekeeping after murder. Normal homeowners don't maintain domestic routines after finding dead bodies. The behavior suggests someone whose psychology was either completely compartmentalized or completely dissociated from reality. This isn't just academic disagreement. These interpretations shaped the investigation in real time. Resources were allocated based on which theory investigators found most credible. Suspects were pursued or dismissed based on how well they fit the prevailing interpretation. The note didn't just record a crime. It actively influenced how that crime was investigated. The investigative impact of interpretive disagreement cannot be overstated. If investigators believed the note pointed to family involvement, they focused their resources on family members. If they believed it pointed to an intruder, they searched for unknown outsiders. The note didn't just provide evidence, it dictated investigative strategy. But investigative strategy determined which evidence was collected, which witnesses were interviewed, which theories were pursued. The note shaped the investigation, and the investigation shaped our understanding of the note. The circular relationship between evidence and interpretation created a closed system that became immune to external correction. Which interpretation feels more disturbing to you? That someone capable of murdering a child could also be capable of such calculated deception? Or that the investigation itself became so compromised that the truth became permanently obscured? The technical analysis of the note reveals additional layers of complexity that deepen rather than resolve these questions. Forensic linguists found evidence of both educated vocabulary and deliberate attempts to appear less educated. Words like attache and adequate suggest sophistication, while misspellings like bussiness suggest either genuine limitations or calculated disguise. The educational inconsistency creates what linguists call performance contradiction. Someone who can spell adequate correctly doesn't usually misspell business. Someone who uses sophisticated vocabulary like attaché doesn't usually make elementary grammatical errors. The pattern suggests either genuine educational limitations combined with pretentious vocabulary or deliberate disguise that wasn't sustained consistently. But educational disguise requires metacognitive awareness that seems incompatible with the psychological chaos of murder. Someone would have to think about how their education level would be perceived while writing about kidnapping and death. They would have to maintain conscious control over word choice while dealing with extreme stress. The cognitive load seems almost impossible to sustain. The grammar is largely correct, despite these apparent attempts to sound less educated. This could indicate someone highly educated trying to disguise their background. Or it could indicate someone of moderate education who simply makes occasional spelling errors while maintaining proper sentence structure. The grammatical competence throughout most of the note suggests someone with substantial educational background, regardless of occasional spelling errors. Complex sentence construction, appropriate use of subordinate clauses, and sophisticated vocabulary choices all point to someone with advanced literacy skills. Yet the deliberate errors create questions about motivation and psychology. Why would someone try to appear less educated while committing a crime that requires considerable planning and sophistication? What psychological advantage does educational disguise provide to someone writing a ransom note? The writing pressure analysis showed consistent patterns that could indicate either natural handwriting or carefully practiced disguise. Some letters were formed with unusual pressure patterns that might suggest deliberate alteration of natural style. Other letters maintained the kind of unconscious consistency that's difficult to fake. The pressure analysis reveals something important about the physical act of writing this note. Consistent pressure patterns suggest someone who was relatively calm and controlled while writing. Inconsistent patterns suggest someone who was struggling to maintain psychological control. The patterns in this note show both characteristics simultaneously. What does this physical evidence tell us about the author's mental state? Were they alternating between control and panic, or were they maintaining artificial control through conscious effort? Even the paper itself tells a contradictory story. The legal pad was found exactly where Patsy kept it for household notes and grocery lists. Someone familiar with the house would know its location immediately. But the pad was also in a relatively obvious location that an exploring intruder could discover within minutes. The paper choice creates another layer of the inside-outside knowledge problem. Using Patsy's personal notepad suggests either intimate familiarity with her habits or someone who had time to explore the house thoroughly enough to understand its domestic organization. But why use paper that could be traced so easily to the house? Why not bring materials that couldn't be connected to the family? The choice suggests either someone who didn't think about evidence tracing or someone who wanted the note to be connected to the house for investigative reasons. The pen placement becomes even more significant under close analysis. After writing nearly 400 words, someone took the time to walk to the kitchen and replace the pen in its exact holder. This suggests either intimate familiarity with the household routine or obsessive attention to detail that borders on the psychopathic. The pen replacement behavior reveals something crucial about the author's mindset. This wasn't someone who was panicking about escape. This wasn't someone who was worried about leaving evidence. This was someone who was concerned about maintaining domestic normalcy even after committing murder. What do you think motivated this specific behavior? Does it indicate comfort and familiarity, or does it indicate something more disturbing about the psychology of whoever wrote this note? The timeline analysis reveals perhaps the most crucial contradiction of all. If JonBenét died between midnight and 2 a.m., and if the note took 20 to 30 minutes to write, including the practice draft, then someone was composing this document while a 6-year-old child lay dead or dying in the basement. The temporal relationship between murder and composition creates a psychological impossibility that investigators have never adequately explained. Writing a coherent 370-word document requires sustained attention, organizational thinking, and emotional control. These cognitive functions seem incompatible with the psychological aftermath of child murder. Yet someone managed both simultaneously. Someone killed a child and then sat down to write elaborate fiction about kidnapping. Someone moved seamlessly between physical violence and intellectual creativity. Someone integrated murder and literature into a single criminal act. This timeline doesn't just challenge the kidnapping narrative. It challenges our understanding of human psychology. What kind of person can move seamlessly from committing murder to crafting elaborate fiction? What kind of mindset allows someone to write about ransom demands and pick up instructions while knowing the victim will never be returned? The psychological compartmentalization required to function at this level while dealing with murder suggests either complete dissociation from reality or extraordinarily sophisticated criminal psychology. Neither explanation offers much comfort to those seeking simple answers. The handwriting experts who examined this note faced an impossible task. They were asked to determine authorship of a document that might have been deliberately disguised, written under extreme stress, or composed over an extended period with breaks. Normal handwriting analysis assumes natural writing conditions. This note was created under conditions that were anything but natural. The analytical impossibility extended to every aspect of forensic examination. Document experts couldn't determine when the note was written because they couldn't establish normal baseline conditions. Linguistic experts couldn't determine educational background because the vocabulary was deliberately inconsistent. Psychological profilers couldn't determine mental state because the content was potentially fictional. Some characteristics that initially seemed to point toward Patsy Ramsey were later explained by independent experts as common letter formations that millions of people share. Other characteristics that seemed to exclude her were challenged by analysts who noted that extreme stress can alter normal writing patterns dramatically. The handwriting analysis became a microcosm of the entire investigation, genuine experts examining real evidence and reaching completely opposite conclusions. The ambiguity wasn't the result of insufficient analysis or incompetent experts. It was the result of evidence that had been created in ways that made traditional analysis impossible. The most honest assessment from handwriting experts was that the note was inconclusive. This wasn't investigative failure. It was recognition that the document had been created under circumstances that made traditional analysis nearly impossible. But inconclusiveness isn't the same as insignificance. This note contains crucial information about the psychology and capabilities of whoever wrote it. They were educated enough to construct complex sentences. They were culturally aware enough to reference current movies. They were psychologically organized enough to create a multi-page narrative while under what must have been extreme stress. The capabilities revealed by the note narrow the field of potential authors significantly, even if they don't identify a specific individual. Someone with advanced literacy skills wrote this note. Someone with cultural sophistication integrated movie references. Someone with psychological organization maintained narrative coherence across multiple pages. These characteristics create what investigators call a capability profile that eliminates large categories of potential suspects while remaining ambiguous about specific individuals. The note wasn't written by someone with limited education, cultural isolation, or severe mental disorganization. But it could have been written by any of thousands of people who possessed the necessary capabilities. They also had access to intimate family financial information, sufficient time to write and revise, and the presence of mind to clean up after themselves. These characteristics narrow the field of potential authors significantly, even if they don't identify a specific individual. The behavioral requirements for writing this note create what criminal profilers call convergent limitations. The author needed to possess multiple specific capabilities simultaneously: educational sophistication, cultural awareness, psychological organization, insider knowledge, temporal access, and emotional control. The convergence of these requirements dramatically reduces the number of people who could have written this note. Yet even dramatic reduction doesn't produce definitive identification. Hundreds of people might possess the necessary capabilities. Dozens might have had the necessary access. Several might have had the necessary motivation. The note successfully narrows the field while maintaining enough ambiguity to prevent definitive conclusions. The FBI's behavioral analysis provided perhaps the most chilling assessment. They concluded that this note showed signs of elaborate staging designed to mislead investigators. But staging implies conscious deception. Someone deliberately created false evidence to point investigators away from the truth. The staging assessment transforms the note from evidence of a crime into evidence of a cover-up. Someone wasn't just committing murder, they were actively manipulating the investigation of that murder. Someone was thinking about police response while dealing with a dead child. Someone was anticipating investigative procedures while their hands were still metaphorically bloody from their crime. This assessment raises questions that go beyond simple guilt or innocence. If the note is staging, then whoever wrote it was thinking strategically about the investigation, even while dealing with a murdered child. They were anticipating police response and crafting evidence to manipulate that response. The strategic thinking revealed by sophisticated staging suggests either advanced planning that included contingencies for things going wrong, or extraordinary psychological control that allowed strategic thinking under extreme stress. Both possibilities narrow the field of potential suspects while revealing disturbing information about criminal psychology. Such calculated thinking suggests either advanced planning or extraordinary psychological control under extreme circumstances. Neither possibility offers much comfort to those seeking simple explanations. But the staging assessment creates new problems even as it resolves old ones. If the note was consciously created to mislead investigators, why was it created in ways that generated so much suspicion? If someone was smart enough to anticipate police response, why weren't they smart enough to create more convincing false evidence? The answer might be that the note succeeded precisely because it generated suspicion and confusion rather than providing clear answers. Investigations focused on interpreting the note rather than looking beyond it. Experts spent decades analyzing handwriting rather than developing alternative theories. The note became the center of investigative attention rather than one piece of evidence among many. Let us know what you think in the comments. Does this evidence point toward advanced planning or exceptional self-control? And which possibility disturbs you more? The investigation that followed this note's discovery became a study in how early decisions can permanently alter the trajectory of a criminal case. Within 48 hours, investigators had essentially decided whether they were looking for someone inside the house or someone outside the house. That decision shaped every subsequent piece of evidence, collection, and analysis. The binary choice between inside and outside involvement created what organizational theorists call analytical lock-in. Once investigators committed to one interpretive framework, all subsequent evidence was processed through that framework. Evidence that supported the chosen theory was pursued aggressively. Evidence that challenged it was explained away or minimized. If investigators believed the note came from inside the house, they interpreted all subsequent evidence through that framework. The lack of obvious forced entry became proof that no outsider was involved. The intimate knowledge displayed in the note became proof of inside access. The time required to write it became proof of unlimited comfort and security. But interpretive frameworks become self-reinforcing through what psychologists call confirmation bias amplification. The more evidence you find that supports your theory, the more confident you become that your theory is correct. The more confident you become, the less likely you are to seriously consider alternative explanations. Early investigative decisions become permanent investigative commitments. If investigators believe the note came from outside the house, they interpreted the same evidence differently. The lack of forced entry became proof of sophisticated criminal capability. The intimate knowledge became proof of extensive advanced surveillance. The time required became proof of elaborate premeditation. Both interpretive frameworks were internally logical and externally supported by credible evidence. Both addressed some aspects of the note while struggling with others. Both were advocated by experienced investigators and challenged by equally experienced investigators. Both generated investigative strategies that produced additional evidence supporting their core assumptions. Both interpretations were logically consistent within their own frameworks. Both addressed some evidence while struggling with other evidence. Both were supported by credible experts and challenged by equally credible experts. The logical consistency of contradictory interpretations reveals something fundamental about criminal evidence. It doesn't dictate its own meaning. Evidence requires human interpretation, and human interpretation is influenced by psychological, institutional, and cultural factors that have nothing to do with the evidence itself. This interpretive flexibility reveals something fundamental about criminal investigations. They're not purely objective processes. Investigators are human beings who must make sense of incomplete information under enormous pressure. The frameworks they choose to organize that information inevitably influence which evidence seems significant and which seems irrelevant. The human element in evidence interpretation becomes particularly problematic when dealing with ambiguous evidence like this ransom note. The note contains genuine information about knowledge, capabilities, and psychology, but it contains this information in ways that support multiple, contradictory conclusions about what it means and who could have created it. In the case of the ransom note, these early interpretive decisions became self-reinforcing. Evidence that supported the chosen framework was pursued aggressively. Evidence that challenged it was explained away or minimized. Over time, each investigative team developed internal consistency that made alternative interpretations seem increasingly implausible. The self-reinforcing nature of interpretive frameworks explains why expert disagreement about this note has persisted for 3 decades. Each side of the debate has developed sophisticated analytical structures that address evidence comprehensively within their own assumptions. Neither side can definitively prove the other wrong because both are working from fundamentally different starting assumptions about what the evidence means. This isn't corruption or incompetence. It's normal human psychology applied to an abnormal situation. But it helps explain why the note has remained such a source of controversy. Different investigative teams, looking at the same evidence, reached dramatically different conclusions based on their initial interpretive frameworks. But the persistence of expert disagreement suggests something troubling about the nature of criminal evidence itself. If credible experts can examine the same document for 30 years and reach opposite conclusions, what does that tell us about the reliability of evidence-based conclusions in general? The media attention that surrounded this note amplified these investigative divisions. Television shows featured expert panels where handwriting analysts, criminal psychologists, and former FBI agents debated the note's meaning. Each expert brought their own interpretive framework. Each reached conclusions that seemed obvious within that framework but implausible to experts using different frameworks. The media amplification created what communications theorists call interpretive fragmentation. Instead of expert analysis producing convergent conclusions that approached objective truth, expert analysis produced divergent conclusions that moved further apart over time. Each expert became more invested in defending their original interpretation as public debate intensified. Public opinion formed along these expert divisions. People didn't just have opinions about who wrote the note. They had opinions about what kind of evidence was credible, what kind of analysis was trustworthy, and what kind of conclusions were reasonable. The note became a Rorschach test that revealed as much about the observer as about the observed. The public's interpretive investment in competing theories created additional pressure on investigators to defend their analytical frameworks. Admitting uncertainty or changing interpretations became professionally and politically costly. The investigation became driven by the need to maintain analytical consistency rather than the need to follow evidence wherever it led. But the media attention also revealed something important about public psychology. People wanted definitive answers to questions that didn't have definitive answers. The ambiguity of the evidence was emotionally unsatisfying. The complexity of competing interpretations was intellectually exhausting. The public demanded simple conclusions about complex evidence. What does this pattern tell us about our ability to handle ambiguous evidence in emotionally charged situations? Do we demand certainty even when evidence doesn't support certainty? And how does that demand for certainty affect the quality of our analytical conclusions? The DNA evidence discovery in 2003 added another layer of complexity rather than resolving existing questions. Touch DNA technology found unknown male DNA on JonBenét's clothing that didn't match anyone in the Ramsey family. This evidence seemed to support the intruder theory dramatically. The DNA discovery should have resolved the interpretive disagreement by providing objective scientific evidence that pointed toward a specific conclusion. Touch DNA is sophisticated technology that produces reliable results under proper laboratory conditions. The presence of unknown male DNA on a murdered child's clothing seems to provide definitive evidence of outside involvement. But the ransom note evidence didn't disappear. The intimate knowledge, the inside materials, the time required, the lack of forced entry, all of this evidence remained. Supporters of the family involvement theory argued that the DNA could have been deposited innocently through manufacturing, retail handling, or secondary transfer. The DNA evidence created what investigators call evidentiary contradiction, multiple pieces of reliable evidence that seem to point toward mutually exclusive conclusions. The DNA suggested an unknown outsider had physical contact with JonBenét. The ransom note suggested someone with inside knowledge and access had created elaborate fictional staging. The result was that instead of one controversial piece of evidence, the note investigators now had two controversial pieces of evidence that seemed to point in opposite directions. The DNA suggested an unknown outsider. The note suggested someone with inside access. Both pieces of evidence were real. Both were significant. Both couldn't be easily dismissed. But evidence doesn't interpret itself. The DNA required human analysis to determine what it meant and how it related to the crime. The note required human analysis to determine who could have written it and why. Both analyses were conducted by credible experts who reached different conclusions based on different analytical frameworks. This created a new interpretive challenge. How do you reconcile contradictory evidence that seems equally credible? Some investigators concluded that the DNA was irrelevant contamination and the note was the key evidence. Others concluded that the DNA was definitive proof of an intruder and the note could be explained through advanced surveillance. The contradictory evidence created new opportunities for analytical creativity. Some investigators developed complex theories involving multiple perpetrators, outside accomplices, or inside enablers. These theories addressed the contradictory evidence by assuming that both the DNA and the note were significant, but in ways that required more complex criminal scenarios. Still, others theorized that both pieces of evidence were significant, suggesting a more complex crime involving both inside and outside elements. Perhaps someone with inside access enabled someone from outside. Perhaps someone from outside gained inside information through surveillance or accomplices. But complex theories require complex evidence to support them. And complex evidence creates new opportunities for expert disagreement. Multi-perpetrator theories address the evidentiary contradictions while creating new logical problems that were equally difficult to resolve. These multi-layered theories address the contradictory evidence more completely, but they required increasingly complex assumptions about criminal collaboration and capability. They solved the evidentiary problem by creating new logical problems. The proliferation of theories revealed something important about the relationship between evidence and explanation. More evidence doesn't necessarily produce clearer conclusions. Sometimes additional evidence complicates rather than clarifies our understanding of criminal events. The case file eventually contained thousands of pages of analysis, expert opinions, and investigative reports. But rather than bringing clarity, this accumulation of analysis seemed to deepen the ambiguity. Every expert opinion was challenged by another expert opinion. Every piece of evidence was interpreted differently by different analysts. The accumulation of analysis created what information theorists call analytical saturation, a point where additional analysis produces diminishing returns in terms of genuine insight. The note had been subjected to every available form of examination, but the examinations produced contradictory results that couldn't be reconciled through additional examination. The Ransom note remained at the center of these debates because it represented the kind of evidence that should provide clarity but instead provided confusion. It was extensive, detailed, and permanent. It contained specific information about the author's knowledge, capabilities, and psychology. It should have narrowed the field of potential suspects dramatically. But instead of producing investigative clarity, the note generated analytical confusion that persisted for 3 decades. The more experts studied it, the more they disagreed about what it meant. The more detailed their analysis became, the more contradictory their conclusions became. Instead, it became the most debated document in modern criminal history. What makes this particularly tragic is that somewhere, someone knows exactly what this note means. Someone knows whether it was written in panic or calculation, whether it represents genuine kidnapping plans or elaborate deception. Someone knows whether those movie references were unconscious cultural echoes or deliberate misdirection. The knowledge asymmetry between the author and the analysts creates a disturbing power dynamic. Someone possesses complete information about the note's meaning and purpose, while experts debate theories and interpretations. Someone can watch 30 years of analytical confusion while knowing exactly what they were trying to accomplish. But that knowledge has remained private while the public debate has continued for 3 decades. The note succeeded in creating exactly the kind of interpretive chaos that makes criminal prosecution extremely difficult. The success of the note at generating analytical confusion suggests either extraordinary luck or calculated design. Random criminal communications don't usually produce 30 years of expert disagreement. Random evidence doesn't usually generate interpretive frameworks that are simultaneously logical and contradictory. If the note was written to obstruct justice, it succeeded. If it was written to create reasonable doubt, it succeeded. If it was written to focus investigation on innocent people, it succeeded. Whatever its actual purpose, the note has prevented the kind of investigative clarity that leads to criminal conviction. The obstruction of justice through evidence creation rather than evidence destruction represents a sophisticated understanding of how criminal investigations work. Someone understood that confusion is more effective than concealment, that analytical disagreement is more powerful than evidentiary absence. This raises a final, deeply unsettling question. Was that confusion intentional? Did someone deliberately create a piece of evidence that would be rich enough to seem significant, but ambiguous enough to prevent definitive conclusions? The possibility of intentional analytical confusion transforms the note from evidence of a crime into evidence of something more disturbing: calculated manipulation of the justice system itself. Someone didn't just commit murder. They actively undermined the investigation of that murder through sophisticated evidence creation. The possibility that this note represents calculated manipulation of the criminal justice system is perhaps more disturbing than the original crime. It suggests someone who understood not just how to commit murder, but how to escape accountability by creating investigative chaos. But intentional confusion requires a level of sophistication about criminal investigation that seems almost impossible to achieve without professional experience or extensive research. Someone would have needed to understand how different types of evidence are analyzed, how expert disagreement develops, and how analytical confusion affects prosecution decisions. The sophistication required for deliberately creating analytical chaos suggests either professional knowledge of criminal investigation or extraordinary criminal intelligence. Both possibilities narrow the field of potential suspects while revealing disturbing information about their capabilities and psychology. The 3 pages of paper found on December 26, 1996 continue to resist definitive interpretation. They contain genuine evidence about knowledge, capability, and psychology. They reveal important information about planning, timing, and intent. But they reveal this information in ways that support multiple contradictory conclusions. The persistent resistance of the note to analytical resolution suggests that its ambiguity might be structural rather than accidental. Someone might have deliberately created evidence that would generate exactly the kind of interpretive confusion that has characterized this case for 3 decades. Every expert who has analyzed this note has found something significant. None have found something conclusive. The document exists in a strange evidentiary space where everything seems meaningful, but nothing seems definitive. The gap between significance and conclusiveness creates what forensic experts call analytical frustration. Evidence that clearly contains important information but refuses to yield that information in forms that support definitive conclusions. The note tantalizes investigators with hints of meaning while withholding the clarity necessary for prosecution. Perhaps that ambiguity was always the point. Perhaps whoever wrote this note understood that elaborate fiction is more useful than simple fiction because elaborate fiction invites analysis that can continue indefinitely without reaching resolution. The strategic value of analytical confusion becomes clear when you consider its effect on prosecution decisions. Prosecutors need evidence that supports conclusions beyond reasonable doubt. Evidence that supports multiple reasonable interpretations creates multiple reasonable doubts. The note's analytical resistance makes prosecution extremely difficult, regardless of what other evidence might be available. The handwriting could be disguised or natural. The knowledge could be inside or researched. The timing could indicate comfort or desperation. The movie references could be unconscious or calculated. The length could represent security or obsession. Every characteristic of this note can be interpreted in ways that support dramatically different conclusions about who wrote it and why. This isn't accidental ambiguity. This is structural ambiguity that seems almost designed to prevent investigative closure. The structural ambiguity of the note suggests sophisticated understanding of how evidence analysis works. Someone knew that creating evidence with multiple reasonable interpretations would be more effective than trying to create evidence with no reasonable interpretations. Complex deception is more powerful than simple deception because it invites analysis that becomes self-defeating. 30 years later, experts still debate every aspect of this document. Handwriting analysts still disagree about authorship. Linguists still argue about the significance of word choices. Psychologists still interpret the tone differently. The persistence of expert disagreement reveals something troubling about the nature of expertise itself. If credible experts can study the same evidence for 3 decades without reaching consensus, what does that tell us about the reliability of expert analysis in criminal cases? How do we distinguish between genuine analytical difficulty and evidence that has been deliberately designed to resist analysis? The note has generated more analysis than any other piece of criminal evidence in modern history, but it has generated very little consensus. It remains as mysterious and controversial today as it was in 1996. Which brings us back to our original question. If this wasn't written to collect ransom money, what was it really written for? The evidence suggests several possibilities, none of which can be definitively proven or disproven. It might have been written to buy time while someone escaped. It might have been written to misdirect investigation toward kidnapping rather than murder. It might have been written to create the kind of evidentiary confusion that makes prosecution impossible. The temporal function of the note becomes clearer when you consider that JonBenét's body wasn't discovered until 7 hours after the note was found. 7 hours during which investigators treated the scene as a kidnapping rather than a murder. 7 hours during which evidence was contaminated, witnesses were compromised, and investigative resources were misdirected. If the note was written to buy time, it succeeded beyond anyone's imagination. If it was written to contaminate the crime scene, it achieved that goal perfectly. If it was written to misdirect investigative resources, it accomplished exactly what it intended. Or it might have been written by someone whose psychology we don't fully understand, someone who needed to create elaborate narrative even while committing horrible crimes. Someone for whom the fiction was as important as the facts. The psychological need for elaborate fiction during violent crime suggests someone whose mental relationship with reality was seriously disturbed. Normal criminals don't invest time in character development and plot construction while dealing with murder. They focus on practical concerns like escape and evidence destruction. But this person invested significant time and effort in creating complex narrative fiction while dealing with horrific reality. The fiction seemed to be psychologically necessary rather than strategically useful. Someone needed to create this story, regardless of its practical value. The note could represent advanced planning or desperate improvisation. It could indicate intimate inside knowledge or sophisticated outside surveillance. It could reveal psychological organization or psychological chaos. What it definitely reveals is that on the night of December 25th, 1996, someone sat down and carefully crafted a piece of evidence that would confuse and divide investigators for 3 decades. Whether that confusion was intentional or accidental, it has succeeded beyond anyone's imagination. The success of the note at creating lasting confusion suggests either extraordinary criminal intelligence or extraordinary luck. Random documents don't usually generate 30 years of expert controversy. Random evidence doesn't usually create interpretive problems that resist resolution through additional analysis. The ransom note that never collected ransom has become one of the most effective pieces of criminal evidence ever created. Not effective at revealing truth, but effective at concealing it. Not effective at leading to justice, but effective at preventing it. The strategic effectiveness of the note at obstructing justice raises disturbing questions about the author's knowledge and intentions. Someone created evidence that has successfully prevented prosecution for 3 decades. Whether this was accidental or intentional, it represents one of the most successful criminal cover-ups in modern history. 3 pages of paper, 370 words, written by someone who knew exactly what they were trying to accomplish. The question isn't who wrote the JonBenét Ramsey Ransom note. The question is, did they succeed in doing exactly what they intended it to do?